June 24, 2024, the day Venezuela's fate was sealed before the first shot was fired. Let me tell you something that almost no one in the mainstream press is talking about. On that quiet Monday in late June, while the world's attention was fixed on the latest NATO summit in Washington, a series of seemingly unrelated events unfolded that, when pieced together, reveal a truth so stark it should chill anyone who understands the mechanics of modern Venezuela. For all its bluster and revolutionary rhetoric, would lose a conventional war with the United States, and not in weeks or months, but in a matter of days. Maybe even hours. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of military strategy, geopolitical power plays, and the often brutal arithmetic of asymmetric conflict. I've advised governments, briefed intelligence committees, and written more classified reports than I care to remember. And what I'm about to lay out for you isn't speculation. It's the cold, hard reality of what happens when a nation with a broken economy, a hollowed-out military, and a leadership clinging to power through sheer inertia suddenly finds itself in the crosshairs of a superpower that has spent the last 20 years refining the art of rapid, decisive warfare. Now, if you've been following the official narrative, you'd think this is all about democracy, human rights, and the noble defense of a free hemisphere. The White House has been methodical in its Venezuela's elections were stolen, its people are suffering under a corrupt dictatorship, and the international community has a moral obligation to act. The State Department's latest fact sheet cites credible evidence of electoral fraud. The EU has condemned Maduro's government as illegitimate, and even the OAS, a body not exactly known for its spying, has called for new elections under international supervision. Meanwhile, the media has dutifully amplified this framing, with pundits on cable news debating the merits of targeted strikes and limited interventions as if we've learned nothing from Iraq or Libya. But here's the problem with this: it's not wrong. Per se, Venezuela is a failed state. Its economy is in shambles, its people are starving, and its government is a kleptocratic nightmare. But the idea that the United States, or any coalition of Western powers, could topple Maduro's regime in a swift, surgical operation is not just optimistic. It's delusional. And the reason has nothing to do with Venezuela's military strength, and everything to do with the geopolitical, economic, and strategic realities that would make such a conflict an unmitigated disaster for the United States. Let me explain. The official what they want you to believe. The story goes like Nicolas Maduro, facing a collapsing economy and mass protests, rigged the 2024 presidential election to cling to power. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, a charismatic, Western-educated economist, won in a landslide, but the regime refused to concede. The U.S., along with Canada and several Latin American allies, imposed new sanctions, froze Venezuelan assets abroad, and began quietly preparing for a potential military response. The Pentagon, we're told, has drawn up plans for limited airstrikes on key military installations, cyber attacks to disable the regime's command and control systems, and the insertion of special forces to secure oil facilities and prevent environmental sabotage. The media has been feeding this narrative in carefully calibrated doses. CNN ran a segment on Venezuela's crumbling air defenses, complete with satellite imagery of rusting MiG-29s and Sukhoi Su-30s, relics of the Chavez era that haven't seen meaningful upgrades in over a decade. The Wall Street Journal published a leaked intelligence assessment claiming that 70% of Venezuela's military hardware is non-operational due to lack of maintenance. And then there's the human rights reports of mass graves, extrajudicial killings, and the regime's use of colectivos, armed civilian militias, as a tool of repression. The implication is Venezuela is a humanitarian disaster, its military is a paper tiger, and the U.S. has both the moral obligation and the strategic imperative to act. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if you dig beneath the surface, if you look at the real data, not the sanitized versions fed to the public, you start to see a very different picture. One that doesn't fit neatly into the good versus evil framing that Washington prefers. The hidden facts they're not telling you. Let's start with the military balance. Yes, Venezuela's armed forces are a shadow of what they were under Chavez. The country's defense budget has collapsed from $4.5 billion in 2012 to less than $1 billion today, and much of its equipment is indeed in disrepair. But here's what the Pentagon's leaked assessments don't tell. 1. Venezuela's air defenses are more capable than you think. The U.S. has spent decades perfecting the art of suppressing enemy air defenses. In Iraq, Libya, and Syria, American forces neutralized integrated air defense systems within hours using a combination of stealth aircraft, electronic warfare, and precision strikes. But Venezuela's IADS isn't some third-rate setup. It's a hybrid system, cobbled together from Russian S-300VM surface-to-air missiles, Chinese JY-27A radars, and even some older Soviet era SA-6 gainful batteries that have been upgraded with Iranian assistance. The S-300VM, in particular, is a beast designed to counter stealth aircraft like the F-22 and F-35. And while Venezuela only has a handful of these systems, they're concentrated around critical oil refineries, power plants, and the capital, Caracas. Now, could the US take them out? Absolutely. But not without losing aircraft. And in an era where the American public has zero appetite for casualties, even a single downed pilot would be a political catastrophe. 2. The Russian and Chinese wildcards. Here's where the narrative gets really interesting. The US intelligence community has been very quiet about two critical. Russia's Wagner Group 2.0. After Prigozhin's failed mutiny, Wagner's operations in Africa and the Middle East were rebranded under the GRU's direct control. But what few people realize is that Wagner never fully left Venezuela. In 2023, U.S. Southern Command detected a surge in Russian military advisors entering the country, ostensibly to train Venezuelan forces, but in reality, to embed with Maduro's inner circle. These aren't just trainers, they're operators. And if the U.S. were to launch a strike, they'd be the ones coordinating Venezuela's air defenses, cyber operations, and even potential counterstrikes. China's debt for oil trap. Beijing has been quietly propping up Maduro's regime for years, not out of ideological solidarity, but because Venezuela owes China $60 billion, most of it in oil-backed loans. If the US were to topple Maduro, China would lose its leverage over Venezuela's oil reserves, which are the largest in the world. And Beijing has made it clear, in private diplomatic channels, that it would respond economically, if not militarily. We're talking about a potential freeze on U.S. Treasury holdings, a dumping of U.S. debt, or even a coordinated move with Russia to destabilize the dollar. 3. The oil. Why this isn't about democracy. Let's be brutally, the U.S. doesn't care about democracy in Venezuela. If it did, it would have intervened in 2019 when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president and the country was on the brink of collapse. Instead, the Trump administration imposed sanctions that worsened the humanitarian crisis while doing nothing to remove Maduro. Why? Because the real issue isn't democracy, it's oil. Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's more than Saudi Arabia. And right now, most of that oil is controlled by Maduro's cronies, who sell it at a discount to China, Russia, and even Iran. If the U.S. were to install a compliant government in Caracas, it would gain control over the largest untapped oil reserves on the planet. But here's the moment U.S. forces cross the border, Maduro's first move would be to blow up the oil infrastructure. We're talking about sabotaging refineries, setting oil fields ablaze, and even sinking tankers in Lake Maracaibo to block shipping lanes. The environmental damage would be catastrophic, but the economic impact would be even a sudden spike in global oil prices, a recession in the US, and a political backlash that would make the Iraq war protests look like a Sunday picnic. 4. The Latin American domino effect. The US has spent the last century ensuring that no hostile power gains a foothold in its backyard. That's why the Monroe Doctrine still matters. But here's the: if the US invades Venezuela, it risks uniting Latin America against it. Brazil, under Lula, has already made it clear that it would not support a U.S. intervention. Mexico, under AMLO, has called for dialogue. Even Colombia, Washington's closest ally in the region, has warned against military action. And then there's Cuba, Maduro's closest ally, which would almost certainly respond by ramping up its support for leftist insurgencies across the region. The last thing the U.S. needs is another Cold War in its own hemisphere. But that's exactly what it would get. The geopolitical how Russia and China are playing the game. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for global dominance between the US, Russia, and China. From a realist perspective, the US is a declining hegemon trying to maintain its unipolar moment. Russia and China, meanwhile, are revisionist powers seeking to carve out their own spheres of influence. Venezuela is just one piece on the board, but it's a critical one. 1. Russia's a second Cuba. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union used Cuba as a forward operating base to project power into the Western Hemisphere. Today, Russia is doing the same with Venezuela. The difference? This time, it's not about ideology, it's about leverage. By embedding Wagner operatives, selling advanced weapons, and providing diplomatic cover, Russia is ensuring that any U.S. move against Maduro would come at a steep cost. And if the U.S. does invade, Russia has already signaled that it would respond asymmetrically: cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure, disinformation campaigns to sow chaos, and even the possibility of a naval blockade in the Caribbean. 2. China's along the Belt and Road of the Americas. China doesn't want to fight the U.S. in Venezuela. It wants to own Venezuela. Beijing has already invested billions in the country's infrastructure, ports, railways, and even a space tracking station in the Andes. And while the U.S. has been distracted by wars in the Middle East, China has been quietly building a network of alliances across Latin America. If the U.S. invades Venezuela, China would use the crisis to deepen its economic ties with the region, presenting itself as the responsible great power, unlike the U.S., which would be seen as a reckless imperialist. 3. The hypocrisy of U.S. policy. Here's the thing about American foreign: it's selective. The U.S. has no problem supporting dictatorships when it suits its interests: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, but it suddenly develops a conscience when it comes to leftist regimes in its own hemisphere. And that hypocrisy isn't lost on the rest of the world. If the U.S. invades Venezuela, it will be seen as just another example of American the idea that the rules don't apply to Washington. The military: why this would be a disaster. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. 1. The illusion of a limited war. The Pentagon's war planners love to talk about limited interventions. But history shows that limited wars have a way of becoming unlimited very quickly. In Vietnam, the U.S. started with advisors and ended up with 500,000 troops. In Iraq, it was supposed to be a shock and awe campaign that would last weeks; it lasted 8 years. And in Afghanistan? 20 years. Venezuela would be no different. The moment U.S. forces crossed the border, they would. Urban warfare in Caracas, a city of 3 million people, with a labyrinth of slums controlled by colectivos. The U.S. would be fighting house to house, street by street, with high civilian casualties. Guerrilla tactics: Venezuela's military may be weak, but its militias are not. The colectivos and the Bolivarian militia, numbering over 2 million, would wage a protracted insurgency, using IEDs, ambushes, and sabotage. Cyber and electronic warfare: Russia has already demonstrated its ability to disrupt U.S. military communications. In a Venezuela scenario, we'd see GPS jamming, drone swarms, and even attacks on U.S. power grids. 2. The logistical nightmare. Venezuela is not Iraq. It's not even Afghanistan. It's a country with crumbling infrastructure, a collapsed economy, and a population that is deeply hostile to the U.S. The U.S. would have secure supply lines. Venezuela's roads are in disrepair, its ports are clogged, and its airports are barely functional. The U.S. would have to rely on airlifts and sea transport, both of which would be vulnerable to attack. Feed the population: Venezuela is already facing a humanitarian crisis. If the U.S. invades, it would inherit a country where 90% of the population lives in poverty. The U.S. would be responsible for feeding, housing, and providing medical care to 30 million people, a logistical nightmare. Prevent a refugee crisis: millions of Venezuelans would flee to Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The U.S. would be blamed for the chaos, and the political backlash would be severe. 3. The escalation risk. Here's the scariest: if the U.S. invades Venezuela, it's not just Venezuela that would respond. Russia and China would see it as a direct challenge to their influence. And they would retaliate. Russia: cyber attacks on U.S. financial systems, disinformation campaigns to sow chaos, and even the possibility of a naval blockade in the Caribbean. China: economic warfare, dumping U.S. Treasury bonds, imposing sanctions on U.S. commies, and accelerating its push for a new global reserve currency. Iran. If the US is bogged down in Venezuela, Iran would see an opportunity to escalate in the Middle East, striking US bases in Iraq, attacking shipping in the Persian Gulf, or even launching a direct attack on Israel. The domestic political why this is really about 2024. Now, let's talk about the real reason the US is considering politics. The Biden administration is in trouble. Inflation is still high, the border crisis is out of control, and Trump is leading in the polls. And nothing unites a country like a war. Just look at the Margaret Thatcher was facing electoral annihilation in 1982 until Argentina invaded. She won in a landslide. The same dynamic is at play here. If Biden were to launch a limited strike on Venezuela, the media would rally around the flag, the GOP would be forced to support the president, and Biden's approval ratings would skyrocket. It's a classic wag the dog scenario. But here's the it would backfire. Because the American public is exhausted by war. The last thing they want is another quagmire. And if the conflict drags on, if US troops start coming home in body bags, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Scenario: what's likely to happen? So, what will happen? Let's run through the scenarios. 1. Scenario 1, the surgical strike fantasy. In this scenario, the US launches a series of precision airstrikes on Venezuela's air defenses, command centers, and military bases. The regime collapses within days, Maduro flees to Cuba or Russia, and a pro-US government takes power. Oil production resumes, the humanitarian crisis eases, and the US declares victory. Why it won't happen? Because Venezuela isn't Iraq in 1991. Its military may be weak, but its militias are not. And the moment the US strikes, Russia and China would retaliate economically, if not militarily. 2. Scenario 2, the quagmire. This is the most likely outcome. The US invades, but the conflict drags on for years. The Venezuelan military collapses quickly, but the colectivos and militias wage a protracted insurgency. The US is forced to occupy the country, facing daily attacks, sabotage, and a humanitarian crisis. Meanwhile, Russia and China escalate their support for the insurgency, turning Venezuela into a proxy war. Why it's bad? Because the US would be bogged down in another endless conflict, draining resources, manpower, and political capital. And the longer it lasts, the more likely it is that the American public turns against the war, just like in Vietnam and Iraq. 3. Scenario 3, the Great Power War. This is the nightmare scenario. The US invades Venezuela, and Russia responds by launching cyber attacks on US infrastructure. China imposes economic sanctions, and Iran escalates in the Middle East. The US is forced to respond, and before long, we're in a global conflict, one that could easily spiral into nuclear war. Why it's terrifying? Because this is the kind of scenario that keeps defense planners up at night, not because it's likely, but because it's possible. And in geopolitics, possibility is often more dangerous than probability. Let me explain why. Most analysts dismiss the idea of a direct US-Russia or US-China war over Venezuela as alarmist. After all, neither Moscow nor Beijing has a formal defense treaty with Caracas, and neither has shown any appetite for a kinetic confrontation with Washington. But here's the uncomfortable: great powers don't need formal alliances to escalate. They just need interests, and Venezuela is a perfect storm of them. Russia, for instance, has already demonstrated its willingness to play hardball in the Western Hemisphere. In 2019, 2 Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela, a move that was as much about signaling as it was about capability. Moscow isn't there to defend Maduro out of ideological solidarity, it's there because Venezuela owes Russia billions in debt, because it's a key node in Russia's global arms sales network, and because it's a pressure point against the US in its own backyard. If Washington invades, Russia won't send its navy to fight the US Fifth Fleet. But it will escalate asymmetrically: cyber attacks on US financial systems, disinformation campaigns to erode public support for the war, and covert support for Venezuelan militias. And that's where things get messy. China, meanwhile, has even more at stake. Venezuela is Beijing's largest debtor in Latin America, with over $60 billion in loans tied to oil shipments. A US invasion would mean those loans vanish overnight, and China would lose a critical supplier in a region where it's already struggling to secure energy resources. But China's response wouldn't be limited to economic retaliation. Beijing has spent the last decade building a global network of ports, intelligence stations, and military outposts, many of them in countries hostile to the US. If Venezuela falls, China could accelerate its support for anti-US regimes in Nicaragua, Bolivia, or even Cuba, turning the Caribbean into a contested zone. And let's not forget the South China Sea, where Beijing could use a US distraction in Venezuela to make a move on Taiwan or the Philippines. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US military isn't built for this kind of multi-front, multi-domain conflict. The Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy explicitly shifted focus from counterinsurgency to great power competition, but that doesn't mean the US is ready for it. The last time the US fought a near-peer adversary was Korea in 1953, and even then, it was a limited war. Today, the US would be facing not just one, but two nuclear-armed powers with advanced cyber, space, and electronic warfare capabilities. And here's the US has no clear escalation dominance in this scenario. Let me give you an example. In 2019, when the US assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, Iran retaliated with a missile strike on a US base in Iraq. The US chose not to escalate further, in part because it didn't want to risk a wider war. Now imagine that same dynamic, but with Russia and China in the mix. If Moscow launches a cyber attack that takes down a US power grid, does the US respond with a kinetic strike on a Russian military base? If China imposes sanctions that crash the US stock market, does the US sink a Chinese ship in the South China Sea? These are the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers, and that's why the Great Power War scenario isn't just a theoretical risk, it's a strategic nightmare. But let's bring this back to Venezuela. The real question isn't whether the US could invade, it's whether it should. And the answer, in my view, is a resounding no. Because even if the US wins the war, it loses the peace. A post-invasion Venezuela would be a failed state, a magnet for criminal syndicates, and a breeding ground for anti-US sentiment. The humanitarian crisis would worsen, not improve, as the country's already fragile infrastructure collapses under the weight of occupation. And the US would inherit a quagmire that makes Iraq look like a cakewalk. Here's the thing about military: they're easy to start, but nearly impossible to end. The US has spent the last 2 decades learning this lesson the hard way, from Afghanistan to Libya. And yet, every few years, some think tank or hawkish policymaker dusts off the same old playbook and argues for regime change. The problem isn't that they're wrong about the strategic stakes, it's that they're wrong about the costs. They assume that the US can control the narrative, that the public will stay supportive, that the allies will fall in line. But history shows that none of those assumptions hold up under pressure. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome isn't a US invasion, it's a continuation of the status quo. The US will keep squeezing Venezuela with sanctions, supporting opposition figures, and hoping that economic pressure eventually forces Maduro out. It's not a pretty strategy, and it's not a quick one. But it's the least bad option. Because the alternative isn't just a war, it's a war that could spiral into something far worse. And in a world where great powers are already testing the limits of brinkmanship, that's a risk no one can afford to take. Now, what most people don't realize is that this status quo I just described isn't some neutral holding pattern, it's an active, deliberate strategy with its own set of consequences, and it's one that's already reshaping Venezuela's domestic politics in ways that could make any future resolution even harder. The assumption in Washington is that economic pressure will eventually break Maduro's grip on power, but that's a dangerous oversimplification. What we're actually seeing is the sanctions in isolation are reinforcing the regime's narrative, strengthening its most hardline elements, and pushing the opposition into a corner where compromise becomes politically toxic. Let me explain why this matters. When the US first imposed broad sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2019, the thinking was straightforward: cut off the regime's revenue, force Maduro to negotiate, and let the opposition step in as a viable alternative. But here's the uncomfortable that hasn't happened. Instead, what we've gotten is a regime that's more entrenched, an opposition that's more fragmented, and an economy that's more dependent on illicit networks than ever before. The numbers tell the story. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, but Maduro's approval ratings, while still abysmal, haven't collapsed the way the sanctions architects predicted. In fact, in the 2020 parliamentary elections, the regime managed to regain control of the National Assembly, not because Venezuelans suddenly love socialism, but because the opposition's boycott left them with no credible path to power. This is where the domestic political dimensions get really messy. The opposition in Venezuela isn't a monolith, it's a fractured coalition of parties, factions, and personalities, each with their own agendas and foreign backers. You've got figures like Juan Guaidó, who was recognized by the US and over 50 other countries as Venezuela's legitimate interim president in 2019, but whose influence has waned as his strategy of maximum pressure failed to deliver results. Then you've got others, like Enrique Capriles, who've argued for a more pragmatic approach, including negotiations with the regime. The problem is that every time the opposition tries to engage in dialogue, the US slaps on new sanctions or issues threats, making it nearly impossible for moderates to sell compromise to their base. It's a classic case of what I call the sanctions paradox. The harder the US squeezes, the more it incentivizes the regime to dig in, and the less room the opposition has to maneuver. And let's not forget the role of the military. One of the biggest misconceptions about Venezuela is that the armed forces are a monolithic bloc waiting for the right moment to turn on Maduro. The reality is far more complicated. The Venezuelan military isn't just a professional institution, it's a deeply politicized network of patronage, corruption, and survival. The generals who matter aren't just sitting in their barracks weighing the pros and cons of a coup. They're running gold mines in the south, controlling smuggling routes along the Colombian border, and profiting from the very sanctions that are supposed to weaken the regime. When the US sanctioned Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, in 2019, it didn't just hurt Maduro, it created a black market where the military and its allies could buy oil at a discount and sell it at a premium. The result? The sanctions made the regime's inner circle richer, not poorer. Here's another angle that gets the humanitarian cost of this strategy isn't just a side effect, it's a feature. The regime has weaponized the crisis, using food aid, medicine, and even gasoline as tools of political control. When the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's fuel imports in 2020, it wasn't just targeting the economy, it was giving Maduro an excuse to blame Washington for the country's gasoline shortages, which he then used to justify further repression. The same goes for the CLAP food boxes, a state-run distribution program that's become a key mechanism for rewarding loyalists and punishing dissenters. The more the US tightens the screws, the more the regime can frame itself as the defender of the people against foreign aggression. It's a narrative that resonates in a country where anti-American sentiment runs deep, even among those who despise Maduro. Now, let's talk about the scenario projections. If we assume that the current strategy continues, and there's no reason to think it won't, given the lack of alternatives in Washington, what does the next 5 years look like for Venezuela? The most likely outcome is a slow-motion collapse, but not the kind that leads to regime change. Instead, we're looking at a country that's increasingly ungovernable, where the state's authority is limited to the capital and a few key regions, while the rest of the country descends into a patchwork of criminal fiefdoms, guerrilla groups, and self-governing communities. We've already seen this dynamic play out in places like Apure, where dissident factions of the FARC and ELN have carved out zones of influence, and in the Orinoco mining arc, where illegal gold mining has turned the region into a lawless free-for-all. The regime's response to this fragmentation has been to double down on repression. Since 2019, Maduro has relied on the Special Action Forces, a notoriously brutal police unit, to carry out extrajudicial killings and disappearances. The UN's fact-finding mission on Venezuela has documented over 5,000 cases of extrajudicial executions since 2018, most of them carried out by FAS. Meanwhile, the regime has also extended its use of colectivos, armed civilian groups that act as enforcers in poor neighborhoods. These aren't just thugs, they're a key part of the regime's survival strategy, providing deniable muscle while allowing Maduro to maintain a veneer of plausible deniability. But here's the more the regime relies on these tactics, the more it erodes its own legitimacy, even among its base. The Venezuelan state is no longer a provider of public goods, it's a predator. And that creates a paradox. The harder the US pushes, the more the regime tightens its grip, but the tighter its grip becomes, the more fragile the state actually is. It's a classic case of what political scientists call authoritarian durability. Regimes that survive through repression often do so at the cost of long-term stability. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of external pressure, it collapsed because its internal contradictions became unsustainable. The same could be true for Venezuela, but the timeline is anyone's guess. So where does that leave the opposition? Right now, they're stuck in a cycle of high-stakes brinkmanship with no clear exit. The US keeps demanding that they boycott elections, but every time they do, the regime consolidates power. The last time the opposition participated in elections was in 2015, when they won a supermajority in the National Assembly. The regime's response? It created a parallel legislature, packed the Supreme Court with loyalists, and eventually stripped the assembly of its powers. The message was elections are only meaningful if the regime can control the outcome. And yet, the US keeps pushing the opposition to play by the rules of a game that's rigged from the start. Here's the thing about these kinds of they don't last forever. Eventually, something gives. The question is what? One possibility is that the regime collapses under its own weight, but that's unlikely in the short term. Maduro has proven to be a far more resilient operator than most analysts predicted, and the military's loyalty, while not absolute, isn't about to crumble overnight. Another possibility is that the opposition finally fractures beyond repair, with some factions breaking away to cut their own deals with the regime. We've already seen hints of this, with figures like Stalin Gonzalez, a former opposition lawmaker, now serving as a deputy in the regime-controlled National Assembly. If that trend accelerates, it could leave the US-backed opposition as little more than a rump faction with no real influence. But the most dangerous scenario, and the one that keeps me up at night, is that the current strategy leads to a sudden, violent implosion. Imagine the US imposes even harsher sanctions, the economy spirals further, and the regime responds by cracking down even harder. The opposition, desperate for a way out, calls for mass protests. The protests turn violent. The military splits, with some units defecting and others opening fire. Before anyone in Washington can react, Venezuela is in the throes of a civil war. That's not a far-fetched scenario, it's exactly what happened in Syria, and it's a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks economic pressure alone can force a regime to capitulate. The problem with all of this is that the US foreign policy establishment is still operating on autopilot. The same people who designed the Iraq War are now designing Venezuela policy, and they're making the same mistakes. They assume that because the US has the military and economic power to shape outcomes, it can control the narrative and dictate the terms of engagement. But Venezuela isn't Iraq, and Maduro isn't Saddam. The regime has spent years preparing for this moment, and it's built a system that's designed to survive exactly the kind of pressure the US is applying. The more the US tightens the noose, the more the regime adapts, and the more the opposition gets squeezed out of the picture. So what's the alternative? I'm not suggesting that the US should suddenly embrace Maduro or lift all sanctions tomorrow. But I am saying that the current approach isn't working, and that continuing down this path risks making a bad situation even worse. The first step is to recognize that the opposition's strategy of maximum pressure has failed, and that the US needs to stop treating Venezuela like a geopolitical chess piece and start treating it like a country with its own complex dynamics. That means engaging with all factions of the opposition, not just the ones that toe the Washington line, and it means being willing to accept that any solution will require painful compromises. It also means acknowledging that the regime isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that the US needs to start thinking about how to manage the fallout of a prolonged crisis. That could mean working with international partners to provide targeted humanitarian aid that bypasses the regime, or it could mean exploring back-channel negotiations to reduce tensions. But whatever the approach, it has to start with the recognition that the current strategy isn't just ineffective, it's counterproductive. Because the longer this goes on, the more Venezuela's domestic politics will harden into a zero-sum game where the only winners are the hardliners on both sides. And that's a scenario no one should want.